Hey guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This is your host Thomas Tyree from On the Hot Podcast. Today, this will be episode number 10 of the Combat series. Of course, this episode will be coming out on all four of our platforms, our Instagram account, our Facebook account, our YouTube account, and our Apple Podcast account. So let's go ahead and dive into the first segment of the Combat series today. I'll be sharing my biggest what-ifs in UFC history. So these are the biggest what-if moments, what-if term of events that would never transpired in UFC history. I put together a pretty good list. So these are my biggest what-ifs in UFC history. Starting off with my biggest what-if is if Brock Lesnar started fighting in the UFC sooner. In my opinion, Brock Lesnar is one of the most underrated athletes that is living on planet Earth as we speak today. Brock Lesnar is a former Division I wrestling champion at the collegiate level. He's a former WWE champion. He's a former UFC heavyweight champion. You name it, Brock Lesnar has done it all. In professional wrestling in college, he's done it in sports entertainment, and he's done it in the octagon. Brock Lesnar is one of the most underrated athletes that lives and breathes on the planet Earth today. So in college, Brock Lesnar as a wrestler won 106, had 106 wins and only had a total of 5 losses. And he joined the UFC dating back to after his first stint with WWE ended back in 2004. He was very young, but then he joined UFC 4 years after departing from World Wrestling Entertainment in 2008 when he was already 30 years of age. So if Brock Lesnar went 5-3-1 in the UFC when he came onto the scene at 30 years old, being a UFC heavyweight champion, with the wrestling background that Brock Lesnar already possessed, being a world champion at the collegiate level at Division I at that, I think Brock Lesnar could have had the potential to be one of the greatest heavyweights in MMA history with the wrestling background if he got into the sport faster. The potential was there for Brock Lesnar. You can't tell me otherwise because he became a heavyweight champion in his first few fights in the UFC organization. So that's the biggest what if Brock Lesnar got into the UFC faster. Next big what if. Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz never fighting each other. So both Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz did come onto the scene to UFC together. They were both up-and-coming rising stars in the early 2010s. Both burst onto the scene and the UFC together. And they both had 2 incredible fights that they had against each other. The first one came at UFC 196 when Nate Diaz stepped in on short notice to fight Conor McGregor on short notice on the UFC pay-per-view event and defeat Conor McGregor by submission in the second round. That was the first fight we got between them. Then the second fight we got between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, we fast forward to UFC 202. Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz went to war in an absolute slugfest between the 2 respective fighters. That went on with Conor McGregor winning that fight by decision, going all the rounds, going to the judges' scorecards. So with those 2, and now that I think about it, it's very unfortunate that we didn't get a trilogy between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz. We probably won't because Nate Diaz is out of UFC now, and he's fighting influencer boxers like Jake Paul. And I don't see him going back to the UFC at this point. Conor McGregor's on his last legs of the UFC career as well. But man, imagine if these 2 never fought. 2 up-and-coming rising stars in the 2010s that are UFC icons forever. What if they never fought each other? Not even twice. What if we never got those fights? How different would their careers be? Where would these 2 respective fighters be today? That's my second biggest what if. My next biggest what if. What if Dana White never bought the UFC organization? So Dana White bought the UFC dating all the way back to the beginning of the 21st century in 2001 and forever changed the landscape of combat sports today. Giving the fans what they want. That's what Dana White has always done, giving the fans what they want, making sure the best of the best fight each other no matter what the circumstances are, money, contracts, any obstacle. There's no obstacle when it comes to UFC because Dana White is responsible for putting together the best of the best to fight each other, and he's been proving that since he's bought the organization since 2001. And he's created a billion-dollar company, a billion-dollar industry since he's put pen to paper buying the UFC organization, turning it to nothing into one of the biggest combat sports organizations in the world today, if not the biggest one in the world today. So there was a guy that was supposed to buy the UFC in the running in 2001 with Dana White, and that was Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Vincent Kennedy McMahon is the mastermind behind WWE. He's the mastermind for building that organization, also turning that organization into a billion-dollar industry as well. But Vince McMahon, at the time, that was not the only thing he was interested in. He was also interested in buying the UFC. We know his history with the XFL, but he nearly bought the UFC in 2001 before he bought the XFL in 2001. His son, Shane McMahon, saw potential in the UFC company, but the family never went through with buying the organization of the UFC. That's a huge biggest what if, because if Dana White isn't the leader, the head honcho of UFC, and Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the McMahons are running a sports entertainment with a combat sports, we don't know what the hell could have happened. And Vince McMahon is still in the running that corporate company of World Wrestling Federation, World Wrestling Entertainment right now. He probably would still be owning UFC if he bought the UFC. So that's another biggest what if they bought the UFC. My next biggest what if Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather never fought each other? This was something that was never, ever supposed to happen. This is a problem that we see now. A lot of people complain that we are seeing guys like Jake Paul, KSI, Logan Paul fight MMA guys. Listen, the reason why this all is happening right now is because Dana White put Conor McGregor in a boxing ring to begin with. And that should have never happened. You have Floyd Mayweather, who originally should have retired 49-0 from the sport of boxing after beating Manny Pacquiao and what should have been his final fight as a pro. Then he's retired for 2 years. You have Conor McGregor, who was a double champion in the UFC and a combat sport in the MMA, in 2 different combat sports. This is where it all started when you have an MMA guy get in the ring with a boxing guy. This is how it all started. And if Conor McGregor never got into that boxing ring with Floyd, yes, he got the biggest payday of his life. So did Floyd. Floyd got his biggest payday as well. But if that never happens, Floyd retires 49-0. Nothing happens to his legacy. Conor McGregor has only won 1 fight since Barack Obama was the president of the United States, because he lost focus. He lost the hunger and desire to be the best like he did when he was the first ever double champion in UFC history. I think that really was the downfall for him, because he started caring about the money, the fame, the fortune, drinking, partying more than being the best of the best, which he once was in the UFC. He was one of the best when he was the double champion. Imagine if that never happens. Imagine if Conor McGregor stayed hungry, loyal to the UFC, not clout chasing for something he had no reason being a part of, getting into a boxing ring with the best boxer in the world and of all time, in my opinion. That's another biggest what if. My biggest, last but not least, biggest what if for UFC history: if John Jones and Francis Ngannou ever fought in an octagon. Listen, if that fight were to happen, it would have been, in my opinion, that would have went down as the biggest heavyweight collision in UFC history. Arguably went down as one of the biggest fights in UFC history as well. John Jones, the baddest man on the planet, the scariest man in combat sports right now, fighting Francis Ngannou, who is one of the most dominant heavyweights in the UFC of the last decade. So when you have something like that, when you have John Jones and Francis Ngannou, 2 men who have the potential to put your lights out with their fists, some straight sluggers, that is everything that you ever wanted. And I do believe that the reason why we're never going to get this is because Francis Ngannou walked out on Dana White because he wasn't happy with the pay that he was receiving. His final UFC fight, he only received $600,000 as the reigning defending UFC champion. Do I blame him for walking out? No. Do I think he's a smart businessman for going to boxing now and fighting Tyson Fury to get a lot of millions of dollars in what should be a spectacle, not a really an exhibition, not a pro fight? Yes, but when I think about it, I think that is one of the biggest question marks that's going to leave a stain on UFC history, that we're never going to see John Jones and Francis Ngannou never fight each other in the octagon. But those are my biggest what ifs in UFC history.